EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm Public Editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. This is a live recording from South by Southwest EDU in Austin, Texas. When someone writing about her cat tweeted, "I would die for you," a surveillance company that was hired by a school district in Texas flagged the post as a potential threat. Automated alerts were sent to the district's superintendent, chief of police, director of student services, and director of guidance. Information about students in Boston public schools was shared more than 100 times with the city's police department, putting the district's undocumented students at greater risk for deportation. And just today we heard in Minneapolis, hackers released a 50-minute video detailing information they have about children, including sensitive data with some kids who were involved in rape cases. The school district called it an encryption event. School districts and surveillance companies say surveillance monitoring is a way to prevent suicides and school shootings, but civil rights advocates are alarmed by the practice. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists who will help us understand student data privacy as a civil rights issue. Elizabeth Laird serves as the director of the Center for Democracy and Technology, Equity in Civic Technology. She works with institutions, including schools, to promote the responsible use of data and technology, while making sure it doesn't come at the expense of privacy and civil rights. Clarence Okoh is Senior Policy Counsel for Justice at the Center for Law and Social Policy, and also a Just Tech Fellow at the Social Science Research Council. He studies the prevalence of police surveillance technologies in schools and examines the role it plays in pushing out Black youth. And Marika Pfefferkorn is the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for School Transformation and the Solutions and Sustainability Officer of the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. She works to raise awareness about the use of big data, predictive analytics, facial recognition, threat assessments, surveillance, and student privacy. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Elizabeth, to kind of kick us off, monitoring programs can allow educators access to students' text messages, photos, even email queries. Can you set the scene for us? How widespread is this technology and how does it work?
Sure. So first, thank you, Kavitha and EWA, for organizing this session. At a huge conference like this, I actually saw a couple of sessions that were dedicated to privacy, which I hope in the future changes. But for now, I appreciate your leadership and hosting us. I also want to thank you all for being here. Something that I'll talk about is something called the chilling effect. What I didn't know is that the organizers would take that literally and make this room so cold. So I just appreciate that you all are here. And for listeners who are hearing it later, we have someone who lives in Minnesota and even she said it's cold. So that is telling you something. So how we got involved with the issue that Kavitha teed up when the pandemic first happened. And there were stories about, students sitting in fast food parking lots trying to access Wi-Fi or sharing devices. With the classroom shifting from the school building to the home, school leaders really stepped up in important ways. And one of the ways that they did that was by expanding the devices that were given to students and their families. And so what we wanted to know is, with this progress of getting students online, which is critically important, and if you're here, I suspect you agree with that, we wanted to know, well, what strings, have these devices potentially come with. And so we engaged a research firm and asked teachers, we polled teachers, students, and parents to say, and it was just like one question on a pretty long survey, how many of your schools are using technology that is monitoring what students are doing on devices, either their personal devices or on school issued devices? And we got the data back. We could not believe what we saw. And even like my colleagues who we think about this stuff all the time, like what percentage of teachers do you think said use this software? Like, oh, I think it's a lot. I think it's like 50%. I'm like, well, buckle up. It was in the mid 80s and our most recent survey shows 89%. So this technology is almost ubiquitous in terms of schools tracking what students are doing online. And so our next sort of question was, well, what is the impact of that? And are certain groups of students experiencing that disproportionately than others? And that is sort of the theme of this session, is civil rights and protected classes of students. And are they being disproportionately affected? And are those harms, are they having negative consequences? And we found that in our most recent survey, the answer is yes. We found that one of the stated reasons that these tools are used is to keep students safe. And safety in primarily two ways. One is, if a student is exhibiting signs that they may be thinking about harming themselves, wanting to intervene before something bad happens. The other commonly cited safety example is now that we're back in school in person, there's been a resurgence of violence in schools. And so also looking for students who may be exhibiting signs that they're thinking about committing an act of mass violence. And what we actually found is that it's far more common for these tools to be used to discipline students. So to actually get them in trouble. 70% of teachers said that this is the stated purpose. This is why they use this tool. So the tools are marketed for safety reasons. And when it's actually comes time, they're being used to discipline kids. And that discipline does not fall equally across different groups. And we found that Black and Hispanic students are more likely than their white peers to report that they or someone they know has been disciplined by this technology. So connection to civil rights, race is a protected class. The second place that we saw disproportionate effects was on LGBTQ plus students. We found that 29% of LGBTQ plus students say that they or someone they know has been outed because of this technology, meaning that their gender identity or their sexual orientation was shared without their consent. So that's almost a third. Almost a third of LGBTQ plus students say that they know this is happening. So if you're thinking about civil rights, now we're talking about sex, also protected. And then the third thing, and I did make a joke about the chilling effect. Now I'm going to talk about it for real. Although my hands are cold for the record, we found that half of students say that they do not feel comfortable expressing their true thoughts and feelings online, which when you think about that in an educational setting, it's all about expressing yourself. It's all about learning. It's about making mistakes. Like that's where you want students to be doing that. And half said that they're not comfortable doing it when they know they're being monitored. And we found that a student with a learning difference or a physical disability were statistically more likely to feel that way. So 6 in 10 students with a learning difference, 7 in 10 with a physical disability said that. So again, civil rights, now we're talking about disability status and this having a disproportionate and negative impact on that group. I never expected to be working on privacy, but I care deeply about students and making sure they all have access to a high quality education. And what I hope we can talk more about in this session is how tools like the ones that we're seeing, I've gone deep on student activity monitoring software, but how they may actually be running counter to what we're trying to achieve. And how can we strike this balance of keeping students safe from the harms that I named, which is acts of mass violence and self-harm. But the other sort of outcomes that I talked about, I would also say that those are safety risks. The whole thing is a safety conversation. I'm tired of hearing the privacy and safety trade-off. I'm talking about safety. Privacy is safety. For the groups that I talked about, the decisions and choices that schools are making could actually make some students less safe in the name of protecting them.
Mm-hmm. Clarence, I think it's really important for everyone to understand that this is not something new, right? This intertwining of science and technology with systems of racial oppression, can you explain how this fits into a historical context?
Yeah, certainly. But let me begin by just, again, echoing gratitude for everybody in the audience and for you, Kavitha, for hosting us and having this conversation. I think when we talk about the kind of use of surveillance technologies in educational settings, we often kind of treat it as though it's a future-facing phenomenon, right? We tend to think about it as this novel, shiny, disruptive force in education. But in actuality, there's a long-standing relationship between racism, between science, and between particularly young Black folks. So if we go back really to the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, we see notions of scientific racism, right? This is a body of beliefs that essentially asserts that there are biological distinctions between different races and that those distinctions are the basis to justify social hierarchies, right? So you can look at, for an example, the one I use all the time is this medical concept called drapetomania. Drapetomania was a medical diagnosis used in the antebellum era, and that diagnosis essentially was a condition of Black folks who wanted to run away. So the idea was that they had this kind of insatiable drive to want to run away from conditions of enslavement. They kind of treated that, they pathologized it, they saw it as a medical condition. And it actually was one of those diagnosable, you could go and look into the medical records and see it as a diagnosable medical condition, right? All of us today would find that to be preposterous, right? The idea that someone has an insatiable desire to run away, that is a actual diagnosis that, scientists are actually lifting up. But that was the case, right? And when you look at the treatment for drapetomania, it was severely beating an individual, right? Kind of, again, reinforcing existing systems of racial inequality, but giving it this kind of scientific veneer to justify those racial hierarchies. So that's what it looks like in the 19th century. But we also have to understand that those types of ideologies have carried through to the present day, that there still continues to be this relationship between science, race, and technology. One area that I would want to lift up for this audience is understanding how, in particular, these technologies are showing up within context of longstanding kind of racial and social inequalities. So, for example, some of the work that I do is supporting a local coalition in Pasco County, Florida. They are seeking to end a predictive policing algorithm that is being used by the sheriff's office to focus on vulnerable young people in the school district. The sheriff's office has access to educational records. They have access to students' grades, attendance histories, and other histories of childhood abuse and neglect. And they use those data to score those young people, to place them on a surveillance list, and they subject them to a series of enhanced surveillance practices. In the course of our advocacy, one of the things that we noticed that folks would never want to talk about was that there was a long-standing desegregation order in Pasco County. In other words, to this day, Pasco County had not satisfied the conditions to come up from underneath that desegregation order. So from the 1970s until the present day, they had not been able to meet those conditions. Right. And yet still they were embracing these kind of 21st century technologies to reimagine and restructure racial hierarchy and racial disadvantage for Black and brown young kids within that community. And so we have to understand these kind of this relationship in both of those senses, right? One, that there is this longstanding relationship between race, science, and technology, but also that these technologies are showing up within a longstanding historical continuum of racial injustice and racial hierarchy within our communities.
Marika, how did you find yourself involved in this world of data privacy?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone that has come out for this conversation and the panelists. So my co-founder, Asim Shabazz, and myself launched the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance in 2017. And we were thinking about the impact of data on the different domains that we work on with technology. And one of the areas that I've always focused on is education. And I was working on discipline disparities in Minnesota. And Minnesota also is known to be comparable to Mississippi with their racial disparities in education. So the context that I brought in is that in Minnesota, 43 school districts had been identified for discriminating in out-of-school suspensions against Black and brown students. And at the same time that was breaking in the news, Ramsey County, the city of St. Paul, and St. Paul Public Schools decided to enter into a data sharing agreement that was to be an innovation and that it was to increase efficiency and effectiveness in identifying young people that were at risk to be involved in the juvenile justice system. So had great intentions of how are we going to support young people to make sure that they're on the right track. And so the community had conversations about this. They had bought into this idea of we want to find better solutions for our young people. And until we actually had the opportunity to read the joint powers agreement between those three systems, we thought we were on track to do so. And then we learned that as an indicator, they were going to use out-of-school suspensions to say that a child was at risk for being involved in juvenile justice system. Well, if a Black child is 8 times more likely than a white child to be suspended, basically what we understood was that they were going to use biased data to determine who was going to be at risk. And so in Ramsey County, they have a history of racial disparities with Black and brown communities. And so that put a red flag up for us. And although we didn't know exactly what they were proposing, we thought that it would be important to engage with these systems and learn more about it. And as a community, we invited teachers, parents, youth to really ask a lot of questions, probing questions that we recognized that the systems themselves had not asked. So in addition to using discipline as a way to identify or flag students, they were also going to be using free and reduced lunch. They were going to be using whether your family member had, or sister or brother, or sibling had been involved in the juvenile justice system previously. They were going to look at attendance. And what we identified is there were racial disparities attached to that, and also that they were coming from a deficit-based approach about young people. So if you were trying to find a solution, we need to strip those pieces back and go back to the community and say, what are the things that we need as a community in order to support our young people so that they can be successful? And what are those indicators of success that we would like to see versus free and reduced lunch, discipline disparities? And once we dug into that, we recognized that these systems had not done their due diligence about the technology itself. And we recognized that Ramsey County's system was about 20 years behind when it came to upgrades and updates. So one, we had questions about, this is a massive amount of data that you'll be collecting, not just from the school district, but from our Ramsey County, which has child protection services, foster care, human services, all of these different departments. The city of St. Paul had the police department. So they were going to be combining all of this data, which was problematic in itself, and then using an early warning risk system with that algorithm that would flag students that were at risk. So we were concerned about the access to all that data. And then we had the question, with all this data that you're collecting, what will you do different on the other end? And the answer to that question was, we will compile a list of resources. We will send a social worker out to the house and say, hey, you've been flagged. We're concerned about your child, and here's a list of resources. So what we identified was, through this technology that was a significant financial investment, was that the outcome was not going to be any different. It was just a smoke and mirrors of using this information to flag our Black and brown children again. And once we had identified that and were able to articulate that, we organized as a community, and we were able to dissolve this unprecedented, innovative, really everybody was on board.
I'm going to ask you to stop over there, Marika, because I want everyone to wait for the end of the story and what you did. But first, I want Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the legal landscape. What are the laws that govern student data privacy? I think most parents would think, like, of course there are laws.
Well, first I'll say, you don't want to find yourself in a position between you saying something and then the end of Marika's story. So thank you, Kavitha, for putting me there. But yeah, in terms of the legal landscape, so what I love to do is ask people when they think the primary federal student privacy law was enacted. However, I'm on a panel of ringers who will certainly, I know that they know the answer to this, so I will just spoil the answer for myself, which is that the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is the main federal student privacy law, was enacted in 1974. So I ask you to think about, what was the state of data and technology in 1974? And what did it mean to protect privacy then? Were we talking about, role-based access and encryption? And no, we were talking about, don't leave a piece of paper on your desk that could have identifying information in it. Make sure you lock your cabinets. Like that was the state of privacy when this law was enacted. So to answer your question, there's certainly a perception, much of which is deserved, that the legal protections that exist around protecting student information are just out of date. They haven't kept pace. When it comes to the enforcement of the law that I was talking about, FERPA, the nuclear option is that federal funding could be withheld if the school district was found to be in violation of FERPA. Actually, I think y'all know the answer to this too. See, this is a problem with being on people who also think about this stuff all the time. I also like to ask, how many times do you think, that penalty has been exercised? The answer is 0. So even though this law has been around for decades, a school district or a school has never had their federal funding withheld because of a violation of student privacy. So there's also, really serious concerns about the law being outdated. It's hard to enforce. You either have, I grew up in Texas, actually. We would talk about, lashes with a wet noodle. So you have that option where you're given the opportunity to come into compliance, or the nuclear option where we're going to withhold federal funding. So because of that, we've seen really starting at, I would say about 10 years ago, states enact just a ton of their own student privacy laws. So at last count, I think it was like 130 student privacy laws to supplement and sort of address concerns, some of which are coming from parents about just this outdated legal landscape. But I think there are similar issues there around enforcement. So we have this patchwork of laws. At the state level, you have an outdated federal law. You also have conversations that are adjacent to the education sector that could affect the education sector around consumer privacy laws. There's a huge conversation happening right now around child safety online, that a lot of that is coming sort of out of the last year, and some concerns with how social media is using information about children. So I would say that two things. I would say the legal landscape is complicated, and those of you who are in schools or working in companies, I'm telling you something that you certainly already know. The other thing that I think is really important to remember about the law is that when you think about protecting students and keeping them safe, which again, privacy equals safety, the law should be viewed as the floor, not the ceiling. Parents expect that you're not breaking the law. That is literally the least you could do, is not break the law. What you want to do is go above and beyond and really center students in these conversations and think about, you want to sort of like threat model, like what are the ways that technology or data collection could be used in ways that we don't intend. I really believe that, folks enter the education space because they want to help kids. Otherwise, truly, we would all be doing something else. Like this is not, we were joking, this is not, always this glamorous lifestyle that we all lead. But, you have to think about the ways that the uses of data or the types of technology that are being used could go wrong. And I was looking at the themes for this conference, which is about being bold and evolving. We need to have that same mindset when it comes to protecting kids as we do with innovating around technology.
Let me ask all three of you this, right? I mean, a lot of people, including me, would think of data as like just data, like its code is like binary ones and zeros and it's mathematical. And why is it, as one Princeton professor said, the new Jim code?
Yeah, happy to kick us off on that. First, shout out to Ruha Benjamin, who coined the term new Jim code. And I think what that offers is an insight into this broader field that's being developed. And I'm going to be careful saying this because I know we're in Texas. Critical race, boogeyman, and digital studies, right? And what it really is looking at is bringing the ideas and the insights from the field of critical race theory into understanding new digital technologies and how they are reimagining racial hierarchies. One of the things I love in Professor Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, she always describes racism as innovative, as dynamic, as evolving. Again, something that's not static and stale and it happened in sepia-tone times in the faraway South, but that it is alive and it's reimagining a future for itself. And that these technologies really are the connective tissue between racial injustice and kind of reimagining or rebuilding systems and hierarchies of disadvantage. And so when it comes to algorithmic bias in particular, I think a couple of key things to note in the context of education. Building off of what Elizabeth just said, we have this kind of landscape of privacy laws that are designed to protect student privacy. But too often, those protections do not integrate or think about kind of explicit civil rights protections, because oftentimes the data that are being used in ways to discriminate against various student populations. So again, kind of going back to what we were experiencing in Pasco, we're seeing that they're using tainted data sets. The same thing was true in Ramsey County and many other communities around the country. They're using data sets that they know have pronounced racial disparities and biases, and yet they are integrating those criteria into their algorithms and using those as a basis for scoring young people. Unfortunately, FERPA doesn't provide a private right of action. That's just a fancy term to say that individuals don't have the ability to bring claims into court based off of a FERPA violation. And similarly, when it comes to various civil rights protections like Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, those protections don't have an individual right of action for bringing disparate impact claims. So if I wanted to say, look, this system that you're using, this algorithm that you're designing is disproportionately impacting Black and brown young people, it's going to be hard to do that. I have to show that there's an individual or an individualized harm and that there's intentional discrimination. In other words, I have to show that this algorithm, no matter how complicated it is, I have to identify what are the criteria, what are the variables, what are the different components that are leading to a racialized or disparate impact on a particular person, right? That's really difficult to do with these modern technologies, right? It is really difficult to go in underneath the hood of an algorithm, parse it out, look at its different components, identify the source of those harms, and then be able to bring a case to court. And again, neither one of those laws provide the opportunity for you to actually move forward under a disparate impact theory. Anywho, let me step back from the legalese and kind of explain more broadly again, just the challenge that algorithmic bias presents for those of us who are in the kind of civil rights community. Again, as Elizabeth was saying, the kind of legal infrastructure that we have really is antiquated. The protections have not caught up with the current state of harms. There's a really pressing need for us to figure out how do we close those gaps to make sure that young people and their families that are experiencing different forms of algorithmic bias or different forms of algorithmic harms are actually able to get the redress that they need. In the meantime, what's really important is for both of those bodies of law, both for Title VI and for FERPA, it's important for federal agencies that do have the ability to go forward underneath those disparate impact claims. It's important for them to step up their enforcement actions and activities. It's also important for them to use their power of influence, right? They can issue technical guidance. They can issue Dear Colleague letters to really help communities around the country understand what algorithmic bias looks like in the schoolhouse and outline strategies for how to deal with it. Another area, a critical area, and I'll wrap up with this, is around procurement, right? The federal government plays an incredible role in providing funding for local school districts and local police departments in procuring surveillance technologies and other type of abusive technologies. And there are very few or any standards that are in place for how the federal government actually goes about ensuring that the technologies that they're funding to local school districts and local police offices are actually in compliance with civil rights and privacy protections. The federal government did a fairly decent job, I think it was last week or week before last, in issuing an executive order, essentially saying that they're going to be taking a more forceful look at algorithmic bias around the country. And that's a welcome development. I think many folks in the advocacy community are happy to see that the White House is taking this as a serious issue. But that's just the first step. Actually taking enforcement actions and holding bad actors accountable is necessary if we're really going to start combating algorithmic discrimination in education.
Mm-hmm. This kind of leads into my next question, which is, in June 2022, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law, and it's generally considered a major legislative victory that addresses gun violence and invests in mental health supports. And it's about $1.5 billion in new annual federal dollars. But some of you are concerned that there are several unintended consequences that, again, harm already vulnerable communities, right? How?
So what we're concerned with is, while we're encouraged to see some of the investments, the long overdue investments in mental health in school districts around the country, we're very disturbed in particular by the $1.5 billion in new funding for the Department of Justice. In particular, they're going to be funding grant streams that we already know are being used to fund these types of technologies in the classroom, in particular, the Stop School Violence Act. The concern is that, again, as I mentioned before, there really aren't any kind of guardrails in place around how districts should or should not be using these technologies, or how they should or should not be thinking about safety strategies as a whole. The bill in particular focuses on expanding resources for threat assessment teams. So that is a kind of integration. I'm sure folks are familiar with this, but these are teams that are kind of put together. They blend law enforcement, school services, and other type of social service agencies to really kind of map out and see what young people are going to be at threat of potentially kind of engaging in an act of violence within schools. The problem is that when you have these threat assessment teams, again, very few guardrails about how they're supposed to be composed, and you're really integrating law enforcement more deeply within how schools are operating and caring about their business. That's what we saw in Pasco as well, that really the threat assessment team was the platform through which the data sharing was happening, that there was a kind of misinterpretation of their obligations under federal and state law, and that they were using this as a conduit to essentially get access to all the data about these young people and integrate it within their surveillance practices. And there are a number of districts around the country who have been doing similar types of practices. Again, this is not something that they have to do, but the federal government has not ruled out these practices. And they could issue guidance tomorrow that says these are a list of prohibited uses of this funding, but they haven't done that. Instead, they're funding this money through the Department of Justice to kind of expand criminalization of Black and brown young people through these surveillance technologies. And it's so important for educators to be on the lookout for this around the country. We know that these type of school hardening provisions, these type of youth surveillance strategies are going to be more and more prevalent as time moves forward. And so it's really up to local communities, it's up to school district leaders, it's up to families, to parents, to young people to really identify when these investments are showing up in their communities and making sure that dollars that are designed to keep young people safe actually meet young people's definition of safety. Young people don't turn to cops, they don't turn to surveillance technologies to think about safety. They turn to each other, they turn to their families, they turn to their educators and other caring adults within their communities to achieve their definition of safety. And we have been encouraging the administration over and over again to fund youth-led visions of safety rather than imposing this type of surveillance state on Black and brown young people around the country.
If I could, can I add?
Absolutely.
So I was first introduced to technology that is monitoring what students are doing, exactly how Clarence is talking about it, which is before the pandemic, it was all about what kind of technology can we use to prevent and respond to acts of mass violence or school shootings. And this was especially prominent after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in Florida. And one of the ways that the legislature responded in Florida is they passed a bill, requiring the creation of a data warehouse that links data across different agencies and departments. It also would include social media monitoring information. And the idea was essentially you're going to build out profiles on students using, almost certainly biased data that's underlying it, without any guidance about what to look for. We don't know how to predict who may perpetrate this type of act. It's so statistically rare, just from a straight up research perspective. Like there's some perceptions of what it might be, but there's just not a reliable way to predict, who might perpetrate these acts. And so you create these profiles where people will go in with their own biases, their own prejudices, and then do who knows what with this information. And I sort of spoke about student activity monitoring software, which is what schools have been using on devices themselves. There's other types of technologies that are also being used that I haven't talked about. Another tool is using artificial intelligence to monitor what students are saying on their social media profiles. This is what they're saying publicly, meaning not on a private account. But the question of privacy there is when a student is saying something on this account, do they think that their school has deployed this algorithm and is tracking what they might be saying? And the example used about the cat, I have 2 cats, so I do relate to that statement. But that's another type of technology that we've seen that is being used in the name of keeping students safe, that comes with all the risks that Clarence talked about, all the risks that I talked about. In addition to that, we haven't really talked about facial recognition. That's a big one. And it can be anything from using a facial recognition system, to control entry and exit to a school. One of my first interviews I did on this was with the Washington Post, where they said, I forget where it was, but they are using these recognition cameras that are going to be able to detect irregular movements in a bot, and try and identify when something bad is happening. And I'm like, well, how? How, if you're taking the perspective of a school system, you're being asked to move with urgency. We are in a crisis. You do not have information about what works. And then you also have companies coming and saying, we can solve this problem for you. And they don't have research on it. None of it is independently verified. And there was a federal school safety commission, and something that no one talks about, but to me was like so important, is they did a tour of the US and they released a report the federal government did. And one of the things that the school administrator said is like, I don't know how to pick between, what, from a security perspective, like how do I evaluate these tools? I just have to rely on what companies are telling me. And there really isn't evidence that any of this works. And so what I would hope that we can do together is also look at the ways that these things can go wrong to mitigate that. I don't think any of us are up here to scare you or to like empower us to say, if we can name the problem, then we can do something about it.
This is the perfect point I was thinking. When everyone thinks there's absolutely no hope, I want Marika to continue her story, because we want to hear what happened in Minnesota, because it really was, if you'll pardon the pun, a tectonic shift in thinking about student data
Kavitha.
privacy.
Oh my God.
I like that.
That was not in the prep.
So in Minnesota, it was basically just assumed that the experts knew what was happening, and then this would go forward without any critique. And so the community first showed up and was having conversation with the elected officials. And I mentioned that it became clearly evident, although the community was like, we don't know what you're talking about, we don't know what's happening, we recognized that many of the elected officials did not either. And so we asked the question, how do we proceed with this if no one has a clear understanding of where we're coming from and where we're trying to go, and what are the potential harms that you have not considered? And so we were having a conversation with the leadership of one of these entities. And I asked the question, this is really critical. This is going to be emerging more and more. We need to be having conversations amongst ourselves as community members, parents, students, but also with our elected officials. And their answer was, that's not our job. And so at that time, the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, we didn't know that we would be able to make a tectonic shift. But what we did say is, as we go through this process, we are not going to be left behind. And so we just decided to launch an education campaign for the community. And the way that we did that was we did a lot of interviewing with the officials about how this process came about, who was involved. And as a part of that, we decided to host a summit where we were going to engage parents directly about what was happening. So we brought in some speakers and some experts to talk about what was happening. And we also knew that there was a lot of intimidation in our community about what this technological language was. So the goal of the summit was to deconstruct the language and invite everybody to be a part of the conversation. And we wanted to identify their points of entry where they could pick up the story and carry it forward. And so as we're convening folks, we did a data clinic, we did a algorithmic improv, because one of the biggest challenges of folks like, I don't even know how to pronounce algorithm. How am I going to go to talk to my elected officials and they're going to look down at me? And so we had to kind of tear that apart and convince them that they were not the only ones that did not know how to pronounce algorithm. And it doesn't matter how it was pronounced, because you know what it actually is. And so we did find that eventually our parents were actually coaching our elected officials about the process and the technology and the tools that would be employed. But what we found is it just took some time with our communities to deconstruct, to kind of translate that information. And through our algorithmic improv, our parents were equipped to go have those conversations and ask the critical questions that the legal team did not ask, or that the teams did not have with their internal departments across those systems to understand where there might be some concerns. And so as tools, we created a data primer, we did coaching, we had data ambassadors, we had data advisors. And so we just spread these conversations. We had house parties where people were actually coming to talk about big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms. We did not couch it in that language. But we had some really critical takeaways, because we didn't know how it was landing, because a lot of people have not engaged the community in these conversations. So we were in a session with some young people, and they were sitting around listening to all these adults talking at them about the crisis that was upon us. And they left, and we're like, I don't know if we really engaged. I feel like there was a disconnect. We needed to approach this in a different manner. And the next day, we got a call from one of those young people, and she said she was sitting in a classroom, looking around the room and saying, if I was the person that was going to designate this early warning signal or system, I would probably label that person as a 5. They always sit in the back of class. They always show up late. They do this, that, and the other. And this student over there, they're in the front. They'd probably be a 1. And she said, it took a moment for me to pause and say, in the last year and a half, we had housing instability. My mom had lost our job. We were living couch to couch. And If they had taken that snapshot of my life at that moment, I would have been one of those students that was identified. And yet, we had already identified those resources and supports in the counselors, the social workers, and the people in that school that were supporting us to get through it. They knew already what was going on, and they had connections, personal connections to the resources we needed. And at the end of that statement, she said, nobody has the right to predict my future but me. And so even though we may not have cased it in this really hip language, they got the idea, and they said, after that moment, we are a part of this, and there is no way that we're going to allow other students and other parents to be marginalized in this process. We also talked with our Indigenous community and the Indian Education Department, which was in St. Paul Public Schools. And they had not been consulted in this. And they said, we as an Indigenous people and representatives of our tribe have data sovereignty. You do not have the right to exchange our data without including us in this proposal. And so all of these instances started coming up where they were giving clear-cut examples of they understood what was happening and that the data-driven decisions were being made by technology and tools and not the people that knew them best. And that the solution was not to invest highly in this technology, but to invest in the people that were closest in proximity to the problem, name the problem, and work collectively to find a solution. And so from that time on, we have been engaging with community, building that muscle, not just with community, but with our policymakers and with the influencers of policymakers to really bridge that conversation. So from the beginning, in the discovery of what is happening, in the design of what is happening, in the implementation of what is happening, we have a feedback loop, and that we are not left to the side because we're not clever enough to understand what is happening to us, because that is what they kept saying from the beginning. You just don't understand. You don't know what we're talking about. We know what is best for you. And so that was a paradigm shifting moment when we had parents going up to city council meetings, to school board meetings, to county meetings, and explaining where their legal team had missed, where their technological team had missed, and where their leadership team had missed. And from that point forward, at minimum, they had a group of community members that they could go to in a consultative role that was built out of respect and understanding between systems and the community and representatives of the young people who we are supposed to be serving.
Marika, is this what's known as public interest tech?
So public interest tech comes out of public law, public interest law, and really at the center of this work that we're doing, how do we center the people that are most impacted and make sure that the work that we're doing is in the interest, and that the public is on board about the direction, that they are coming up with the solutions, they are naming the problems, and that there's actually an ecosystem of folks that are working around to bring all these pieces together when we do make decision making.
Can I add something to Marika? I just wanted to say, when I first met Marika, it was when we were on a panel together. I was actually moderating it, and Marika was on the panel, and I didn't know anything about this work. So I just wanted to give her a shout out that in my dark moments where this feels overwhelming, I'm like, how are we going to move the needle on this? The work that they have done and working with students to teach them about algorithms is really incredible. And so you are like my North Star about how we can take, what feels overwhelming and feels very scary and hard to conquer. And there really are examples of how you can empower and engage communities around this that I think is really hopeful.
Absolutely. I think Marika talked a little bit about the feedback loop and including the community. But Clarence and Elizabeth, if you had like two things on your wish list for what you would like to see different when it comes to these monitoring technologies, what would they be?
Oh my gosh. That's a quick question. Okay.
Quick question.
I would hope that everyone sees a role for themselves in this, and that this is not about legal compliance. It's not even just about security or privacy. It's really about doing right by our kids. And if you have that mentality, it will lead to better decision making.
Mm-hmm. Clarence, what would you like to see done differently?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I guess I return to like the roots of this work, which is when I think about the young people that we've spoken to, many of them bring an abolitionist perspective and say that there is no role for policing, that there is no role for these kind of punitive measures in school. And so I would love to live in a world where we do have the abolition of youth surveillance, right? Where we don't see this kind of need to control Black and brown young people, how they move, how they relate to one another, how they live their lives, to kind of create a world in which they have the conditions to flourish and to be safe on their own terms and their own conditions. That, I think, is my wish list item.
Mm-hmm. I want to give all of you panelists the last thought. I typically ask people, what is the one thing you want me to take away from this conversation? And I don't mean for the next day or the next week. I mean something you want us to really think about forever and carry with us. Elizabeth?
Well, I already scooped myself. So the more that we understand the harms that can happen when students' privacy is violated, the more that it becomes about safety. So I finding myself increasingly pushing back on what I'm asked about, oftentimes by reporters, of how do you manage this? What do you say to people who say that trading off privacy is worth safety? And I think hopefully you heard, like, outing an LGBTQ plus student against their will is actually harmful to them. It makes them less safe, and it can actually be the catalyst for a mental health issue. Clarence talked a lot about police. 44% of teachers say that they know of a student who's been contacted by law enforcement because of this technology. So there are communities where a police officer showing up at your house in the middle of the night is not actually going to make them any more safe. So I hope you take away and push back on this trade-off idea. And really, we're all talking about safety, and privacy is an important component of that.
Clarence?
I think it's essential to place young people at the center of these conversations. And I'm not saying that just as like a generic statement. Like, too often when we talk about these technologies and privacy and young people, we talk about it from the perspective of the technology. So let's talk about, facial recognition. Let's talk about predictive policing. Let's talk about social media monitoring. But at the end of the day, what those things all have in common is that they are trying to surveil and control the same population of young people, right? We are talking about marginalized young people who are being subjected to these technologies. The other point to that I would want to make is that oftentimes we think about this only in the educational context, but really it's what's happening outside the school system is just as important as what's happening in the school system. So the surveillance that's happening as a part of just general police surveillance tactics for their neighborhoods, the kind of technologies are showing up like automated license plate readers and predictive policing, all these other things. Those technologies are still impacting these same young people, right? And so I think it's so important to just really start from the experiences of young folks and then look out at the ways in which they're being harmed, rather than looking at the harms and trying to kind of figure out how they can support young people.
Mm-hmm. And Marika, you get the last word.
Thank you. I just want us to remember and remind us that technology is a tool and that our goal is to center humanity.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Let's give it up for our panelists, Elizabeth Laird, Marika Pfeffelkorn, and Clarence Okoh. We'd love to continue the conversation on Twitter @EdWriters. A huge thank you to the South by Southwest team and EWA staffers who helped make this episode happen. Casey Fabris and Judy Oberbantu are here at this conference, as well as Laurie Crouch, Angelina Liu, Kristan Obang, and CD Davidson Hires. As always, we're grateful to Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.